Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me. Thank you for your time. Goodbye.
Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. As India celebrates 75 years of independence, what have those 75 years meant for India's southern states? They're not just a critical part of our federation, but many believe they are by far the most dynamic part. Joining me to explore that question is the Finance Minister of Tamil Nadu, P. Thiaga Rajan. Mr. Thiaga Rajan, in 1962, in his maiden Rajya Sabha speech, the founder of your party, the DMK, Nadu, said, and I'm quoting him, "Dravidians demand the right of self-determination. We want a separate country for southern India." Although after the Chinese war, he changed his mind and dropped this demand, 60 years later, has this sentiment completely disappeared, or does it linger in minority quarters?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for this chance to give a perspective from the South. Actually, your question is a very profound question, because we have to go back to the roots of what we call the Dravidian movement, which we all belong to and whose tenets we all follow. And the core of it was this notion of self-respect. You see, in a culture that had millennia of stratification of human beings by, who can do what and who can go where and who must do what and so forth and who must not do what. The notion of breaking these bonds and breaking these structures and hierarchies started with the notion of self-respect. Self-respect means because I am born, I am equally a human being as anybody else. And I don't need to get validation or respect from anybody else to be considered of some status. Why that's so important is, if you start with the notion of self-respect, everything flows from that. You start with self-respect, the next logical step is independent thinking. Therefore, you got to have education. You got to have the capacity to reason for yourself, rational thinking. Then you go pretty quickly from there to say self-determination. Should I not have some say in how my life is going to turn out? And all over the world, this kind of thinking leads to the next logical thing, which is local self-governance. So this notion of we should have a bigger say in how we are governed, that we should have the right to self-determination, flows from the core principle of self-respect, of social justice, of everybody's equal. And it was that basis on which Rana, the founder of the DMK, made his comments back in his maiden speech in the Rajya Sabha. But as you say, there was a kind of tension between the notion of self-respect, self-determination, rational thinking, etc., and the notion of a nation, which, as you know better than anybody, it was carved out of, again, a culture that was thousands of years old. Many different rulers had come and gone at different times. At some time, it was integrated under Ashoka, the great emperor, some part of India, some part in southern India, we had the great Chola Empire. Then we had the invaders, we had the Greeks come in, we had the Mughals come in. So this land that had been in history for millennia and with like civilized progress from the Indus Valley onwards, Suddenly you were creating a nation out of something that had never been before. And therefore, you had to find some way of balancing the two. And I think that's the balance, especially after the China war, that made Anna switch his views.
But tell me, has that sentiment, that request or that demand for a separate country completely disappeared, or does it linger in some quarters of Tamil Nadu to this day?
Yeah, it's hard for me to say what all exists at what levels, but I would say the thirst for self-determination, the massive support for states' rights, the huge opposition to a centralizing, colonizing force, whether that colonizing force starts from Delhi or from London, all those are innate to our existence, in our blood. So, I'm not sure what the kind of nation concept is. I don't go around taking polls on these, but the right to have self-determination is innate to our existence, and that continues.
And that continues. Okay. Now, in 1962, when Annadurai made this demand, it didn't really create such a stir. Nehru may have blanched, but he regularly accepted Annadurai's right to free speech. Had Annadurai spoken today, the response would have been very different. It would have been considered sedition. He might have been arrested immediately. What does this tell us about how India has changed over the last 75 years?
It tells us something that we should all feel both concerned and I mean, even maybe alarmed, and certainly less than very proud about. Because, free speech is integral to the progress of the society. We fight for freedom. What does freedom really mean? Freedom surely includes a component that is free speech. And we are increasingly becoming a society, though it's not unique to India, but it's happening all over the world in some extent. But, it doesn't bother us what happens outside in other countries. We are Indians. What happens in India bothers us. This notion that there's only one acceptable approach, there's only one acceptable perspective, that there is a know-all, be-all, force, and everybody else must kowtow, otherwise you'll be branded anti-national. Forget sedition. You'll be branded anti-national and some epithets like urban naxal and all these kinds of nonsense. This should alarm us greatly. This is not the sign of a healthy, progressive country with a great future.
So what you're saying is the fact that what Annadurai could say without any fear and without any reaction in 62 would be considered anti-national and sedition today suggests that India has not progressed. It's become narrow, it's become intolerant, it's become anti-democratic. That's what you're saying, isn't it?
I am saying it's a regression. I'm saying that when the notion of a country was only about 15 or 20 years old, when it was not clear whether it would survive, when, as I say, you carved out this country out of thousands of years of culture and tens of kingdoms and all history, even then it was considered acceptable speech. Now you have this country that is strong, vibrant, robust, has a big defense force, 75-year track record. You should have thought it should put down all those fears and allow for even more openness. In fact, we have regressed to the point where, there's a very narrow spectrum of acceptable speech and everything else is labeled immediately unpatriotic, anti-national, urban naxal, all this nonsense. So it's a regression, I would say. It's a regression of democracy. It's a regression of freedom.
Against this background, let's explore the relationship between the states and the central government. India officially is a union of states. Federalism is a key part of our constitution. The federal principle is fundamental to the integrity of India. From your point of view, as you see things from Chennai, how effectively and how sincerely have we implemented and adhered to the federal principle?
Again, I'll just start maybe at a slightly earlier point in time. I think in the Constitution itself, though the word federalism and though the notion of federalism and though the words union of states appear, in fact, if you take our Constitution relative to any other country in the world that is either advanced or large or both, we have a very, very central power focused kind of Constitution. There's very few other places in the world. I've made this point many, many times. I'll make it here again. If you take avowedly, self-avowedly communist China on one extreme, and again, self-avowedly capitalist America on the other extreme of the right-left spectrum. In both of these countries, the devolution of powers to the states, to the districts, to the cities, to the panchayats equivalent are much, 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 much greater than was even envisioned in the Constitution. Right? So I lived for 20 years in the US. The town or village that I live in has its own school board, its own police force, its own kind of retail laws, and so forth. The county I lived in set its own sales tax and its own liquor laws. The state I lived in collected its own income tax, gave its own permits. And this is true in China. You go, the mayor of Shanghai has his own police force, has his own environmental clearance, has his own industrial permits. This is how devolved countries work. In our case, maybe because of this, again, trying to carve out something out of nothing, trying to create a country that never existed before, after saying all these words that came from their hearts, the actual constitution was actually a very central focused constitution. Now that became worse and worse. During emergency, Mrs. Gandhi amended the constitution and took a bunch of subjects away from the state list into the concurrent list. And those of us who came from relatively prosperous, relatively progressive states were keeping on complaining about the centralization from independence. In fact, that drove a lot of Anna's concerns. Anna's concerns would have been much less had we had a truly federal constitution and true devolution of powers. Now, the irony of all this, let me just say one last thing. The irony of all this is, in the modern era, in the last 25 years of India's history, the greatest champion of states' rights, the greatest complainer against centralization was none other than the Honorable Prime Minister Narendra Modi when he was the Chief Minister of Gujarat. I say it again and again and again. Every single thing I say about states' rights that I have ever said in any public platform is a milder version of something that Narendra Modi has said as Chief Minister of Gujarat. So this is it's not unique to the Dravidian, it's not unique to the Tamilian, it's not unique to PTR. It is a concept that is natural to all states.
But you're making a very important point. You're saying, despite the fact that our constitution commits us to a federal devolution of power, and despite the fact we talk about federalism, the actual devolution has been fairly minimal and nothing like what the states would have wanted. Now, you cited the example of Narendra Modi and the contrast between his rhetoric when he was Chief Minister of Gujarat and his behavior today as Prime Minister of India. When he first became Prime Minister in 2014, he spoke about cooperative federalism. A few days ago on Independence Day, he spoke about competitive federalism. How do you understand these terms, and do you welcome them, or are they, in your eyes, just rhetoric?
I think they're not just rhetoric, they are misleading rhetoric. I think when the actions and the words are completely opposite to each other, then you have to say that it's an attempt to subvert the reality by creating a myth or a perception that is false. Every action the Union government has taken, from the introduction of GST to legislation on state subjects, to writing policies on things that are clearly within the state's domain, education policy and so forth. These are counter to the notion of devolution of power. So every action, cooperation is a state subject. Why is there going to be union legislation on it? Agriculture is a state subject. Why were there 3 major farm bills? Dams and ports are state subjects, minor. Now they're going to regulate that also out of Delhi. So this notion that you can say the words and then your actions are exactly opposite those. In most democracies, that would not be kind of sustainable. Somehow in our democracy, a lot of people don't seem to ask the question why the words and the actions are directly 180 degrees opposed to each other.
Let me at this point bring up one by one 3 developments that I imagine, going by what you've just been saying, would be of great concern to you. The first is this government's not so subtle attempt to make Hindi the link language, to promote Hindi and its status. And many believe that what lies behind this is an attempt to push the primacy of the Hindi belt. How do you respond to this development, which has been happening for a couple of years at least?
Yeah, I mean, this is, again, there's nothing new under the sun, as the saying goes. This is at least the 3rd or 4th attempt to do this. This is not some great innovation or genius on the part of the current regime. in Delhi. The first wave of this happened in the 1930s, pre-independence. There was a huge anti-Hindi agitation in what was then Madras Presidency, including the loss of lives and riots. This was taken up again in the 1960s. Again, there was a massive anti-Hindi agitation in India, including riots and the loss of lives. Every time you try to homogenize people through language or any other way, you are going to find resistance from all those people, particularly all those people who, as I say, have self-respect and an identity. Now, you see, our cultures go thousands of years back. The language is the major artifact, the core of our culture. If you try to dilute our language using these kinds of subterfuge, we are going to push back. Let me ask the same question Perennier Anna asked. He said, if we have a two-language policy as a uniform policy across all of India, then automatically the mother tongue is the first language. You may remember that after independence, the states were carved out on the basis of differences in language, which at that point, the reason they carved out a different Uttar Pradesh and a different Bihar and a different Rajasthan and a different, Madhya Pradesh, was that they actually had their own languages. They were not all what you and I think of now as the Hindi belt, were not all homogenized Hindi. They had their own languages. But it was the insertion of Hindi that basically suppressed and killed off all these languages. And there's evidence to show that wherever you try to bring this homogenizing language, there's a problem. So what Anna said, let's have a two-language formula. Everybody uses their mother tongue as the first language. Everybody uses English as the linked language. The same linked language that connects all the states also connects us to the world. We think that's eminently sensible. We follow that in India. In Tamil Nadu. Now, if you say you need to have a Hindi component to it, and as the NEP says, a three-language policy, I ask the question, what does a three-language policy really mean? It means that those in the Hindi belt cannot have a two-language policy. They don't have the capacity to teach people English. They don't have the desire to teach people English. So they will all have a one-language policy of only Hindi. Therefore, those of us like people in Tamil Nadu will have to learn Tamil for our mother tongue, English to connect to the world, and Hindi to connect to those who are chauvinistic enough to only have a one-language policy, because only then we can link to them. Why is this fair in a democracy that you should have a three-language policy for the developed parts of the country and a one-language policy for the underdeveloped parts of the country? How is this fair? So we stick with a two-language policy, and we are completely opposed to either a three-language policy or the imposition of Hindi. If people want to study volition, any language under the sun, we are happy. We are a culture that prides ourselves on education, on knowledge, on erudition. We are wonderfully happy and pleased to support anybody who voluntarily wants to study any language. But if you make it a policy, we are opposed.
Now, the second development, which I imagine would be of concern to you, happened just about 3 weeks ago. BJP President JP Nada publicly said that it was his party's ambition to electrically finish off regional parties, presumably to thus ensure that the party that rules at the center also rules in the states. How do you respond to this attempt to create effectively a one-party country?
I'm glad that Mr. Nada's real kind of intentions and his ambitions on behalf of the party are out in the open. Maybe somebody can give Mr. Nada a history book. He may want to think that that was what existed in India at independence. I think except one state or maybe two, every state was run by a Congress government, as was the union. In fact, during independence, I think all but two states were Congress governments, and Mrs. Gandhi had, during emergency, Mrs. Gandhi had two-thirds majority in the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha. How well has that turned out for them? So I think this notion, what Mr. Nada's statement says is that it exposes that the BJP is simply a mercenary party that is driven by electoral and power ambitions alone. They don't have any value other than that. Because what they're trying to say is that anybody who has independent thinking, anybody who wants a separate identity, anybody who wants... Listen, look at the scale of this country. Tamil Nadu is about 80 million people. Were it a country on its own, it would be about the 19th biggest country in the world. UP is about 200 million people. Were it a country on its own, it would be like the 4th biggest country in the world. Why should there be one party that runs all of this? They can barely do the job well of running the union. Why do you think they're going to be fit to run all these states? Now I ask a different question. The BJP itself is a complete can of contradictions. They are pro-beef in Goa and in the Northeast. You can get killed for carrying cows in the Hindi belt. How is this the same party? That means you say you have a party that has no core values, no core beliefs. All you want is a party that is a vehicle for ambition, for agglomeration of power and pelf. Let Mr. Nada's statement, I welcome it. Let it be out in the open. Let everybody in the country understand what this party is really driven for. It's not for values, it's not for nationalism, it's for the personal ambition of the people who run the party.
Now, the third development that I imagine would be a cause of concern for you still only lurks on the horizon. I'm talking of the redrawing of Lok Sabha constituencies, which will happen sometime after 2026. The Hindu newspaper has calculated that there's a very good likelihood that Tamil Nadu, your state, could lose 11 of its 39 seats. That's almost 30%. Kerala could lose 6 out of 20 seats. How do you respond to this prospect? I know it's still a few years in the future, but how do you respond to it? Because it's a real fear.
Yeah, something is profoundly wrong in this country and has been for a long time. And I'll give you both sides of it. On the one side of it, the relatively well-to-do states are giving up more and more of their money to the union and to the poorer states. And unlike in every other federal society, that doesn't narrow the gap. Despite more and more net transfers of wealth, the gap between the poor and the rich states keeps on increasing. Not just increasing, accelerating. Something is structurally wrong. I made this point to the 15th Finance Commission. The second part is, if you have one person, one vote, then clearly if you have a situation where some states have one MP for 1.5 million people and some states have one MP for 2 million people, it's not truly representative democracy. So something has profoundly gone wrong in the way the states are administered, particularly if you take the fact that the poorest states in the country, the Hindi belt, also happen to be the ones with the highest population growth and the highest total fertility rate, and vice versa. The well-to-do states in the country also happen to have the smallest population relatively per capita or per square kilometer, and also have very low total fertility rates. No other federal society in the world you can find this. Everywhere else, wealth transfers bring convergence in quality of life, and mobility of labor ensures that the greatest economic areas are also the areas of greatest population. We have a big problem in India. This is not going to be solved by light things. This is not, I mean, the redistricting is only the manifestation of a structural problem you have. And responsible leadership at the federal, at the union level should really have been thinking about these things much more profoundly than just about a date and time. How do we overcome? Don't we want everybody to progress? How is it fair in this country if some people keep on falling further and further and further behind? Something is wrong. You know, that's what national leaders are supposed to focus on, not power grabs and like homogenization.
Let me ask you this. Do these three developments, the attempt to promote and impose Hindi, the threat to regional parties that Mr. Nadda's comment symbolizes, and the redrawing of Lok Sabha constituencies, do these three developments have the potential to threaten the unity and integrity of our country?
These three developments are either symptoms or outcomes or artifacts of a profound problem. The profound problem is that this country is not developing evenly. The profound problem is that some parts of the country where governance is good and the values have been good are progressing well economically. Some other parts of the country are progressing well economically, but not with social justice. There's a huge difference between the economic progress of Gujarat and the economic progress of Tamil Nadu. In my preference, I would much rather have both have double the national per capita income, but ours being, let's say, 5,000 or 8,000 rupees less per person out of 3 lakh bench or base. We have 80% plus of our girls graduate high school. That number is only 60% for Gujarat. We have 4 doctors, almost 4,000 people. That number is only 1 in Gujarat. I would rather trade off that marginal 8 or 10,000 rupees out of 3 lakhs for the sake of having a more fair, more just, more inclusive society. But even these are only nuanced differences between Gujarat and Tamil Nadu compared to the difference between Gujarat and Tamil Nadu in one bucket and Bihar and UP on the other bucket. Something is structurally wrong. Parts of the country are being left behind. Hundreds of millions of people are not getting development. This needs to be fixed. All the three problems you tell me, or the issues you tell me, are artifacts, are outcomes of a profound problem in this country. That problem needs fixing.
But profound problems often end up breaking up a country. Does that danger lie ahead, even in potentiality?
Look, everything is potential, right? As many people have pointed out, the notion that you could carve out a country of what is now 1.3 to 1.4 billion with so much disparate history, culture, language, and keep it together for so long itself is a miracle. India today is a miracle. There is no other kind of example in history where you have brought such disparate cultures with disparate kind of food, language, history, brought them all together, created an administrative unit in 75 years, which is the blink of an eye relative to our thousands of years of history, and made it work successfully for the most part as a democracy. We are a miracle. The miracle is a threat any time of not being a miracle anymore, right? By the very fact that you're a miracle, you should be paying attention to ensuring you can make this continue. I'm not sure that enough minds are working on it. So, of course, then I'm always in fear that the miracle may not persist.
That's very clearly put. India is a miracle, but miracles by definition are under threat all the time, and you're worried that the Indian miracle may not persist. We're coming towards the end of this interview. Let me ask you about GST. It was supposed to change the architecture and the landscape of the country. In particular, it was supposed to alter and change center-state relations. Clearly, that hasn't happened. So what went wrong? Was it wrongly conceived, or was it poorly executed?
All of the above. I think, again, I speak now as a professional. I'm not speaking as a politician. And I say this independent of whether it's the BJP or the Congress. I say from the minute it was ever the conception began, it was not well done. From the earliest days of conception. In fact, again, I only echo former Chief Minister of Gujarat, Narendra Modi's comments, that it was a very, very badly thought of and very, very badly conceived system. Of course, the implementation has been, let's put it, in the notion itself, there were a lot of flaws. The ambition was too high for the tool. That's where I should start. From there, the design of it had serious limitations. From there, the implementation was even worse because it was rushed for overnight, and then the makeup, that hundreds of amendments that came in 6 or 8 months. More than any of it, I can't rewrite history. It is what it is. The greatest pain I have right now as a member of the GST Council and as a member of multiple subcommittees or group of ministers, the amount of attention, effort, application of mind, persistence, continuity is very low. We are not acting as if this system is in imminent need of fixing. Everybody has a day job. Every member of the GST Council is a minister doing something else. Every bureaucrat has some other day job as revenue secretary or finance secretary or commercial tax secretary. We are not putting enough attention into improving what is bad in notion, bad in conception, bad in design, bad in implementation. It is even worse in actual, execution every day. That worries me because that's fixable. I can fix that today. I can't fix all the old stuff today. I can fix the speed or the focus or the diligence or the application of mind today.
But you're saying something that is actually very worrying. We don't have the time, possibly we don't have the inclination to fix the problem. The problem is fixable, but because we don't have the time and inclination to do it, we're stranded with this. It will continue.
Yeah, I mean, let me ask a simple question, right? The GST design calls for a meeting every 3 months, every quarter of the council. The council has so far met 47 times in 5 years. Let's take away a few of those for COVID. Let's take away 3 or 4 meetings for COVID. What happened to the rest of the meetings? Right? Even the frequency of the council meeting itself. I mean, there are hundreds of unresolved issues. There are thousands of improvements that can be made. In my opinion, as a former corporate executive, if I had 100 people of high skill, auditors, lawyers, tax specialists, IT specialists, if I had 100 of them working on this full time, every day, there's enough work for 2-3 years where we can make improvements on the existing system. We don't have any of those people.
Let me at this point come to another issue that is becoming a matter of concern to many people in the country. It's what several people call India's Pakistan obsession. As you see things from Chennai, is this a North Indian phenomenon, perhaps pertinent in particular to people in Punjab and Bengal because they border and they were split with Pakistan when independence happened? Or does the whole country share the same level of Pakistan concern?
Look, it's hard for me to say because geographically, and historically, the southern part of the peninsula of India has been less subject to invasion and intrusion. I'm saying over 1,000-year perspective, a couple 1,000-year perspective. But we are one country. We are patriots. We respect. And as you pointed out in the 62 war, Perani Ranna was one of the greatest supporters. In the 71 war, we raised the greatest money out of Tamil Nadu. In the Kargil effort, we gave 25% of the entire funds collected by the Union government came out of Tamil Nadu. So we are not saying because we're far away, we don't perceive the same patriotism. We are as patriotic as anybody. What I have a problem with, and this is on both sides, both in Pakistan and in India, for decades, politicians who are not able to deliver on roti, kapda or makan, who are not able to build water systems and roads, used each other's countries as the kind of rabble-rousing and kind of fear-mongering. Oh, Pakistan is out to get you. Oh, India is out to get you. Pakistani politicians using India as the kind of thin end of the wedge, and in vice versa. I am of the perception, maybe I'm wrong, I'm of the perception that those kinds of things have come down over the last few decades, that everybody understands that Pakistan is not interested in trying to invade India or get in a nuclear war. And everybody in Pakistan understands India is not interested in trying to invade Pakistan or reclaim something and get into a nuclear war. So I would hope that better education, better awareness, more globalization, more kind of international integration helps reduce this jingoistic or kind of xenophobic and the separation of time between the wounds of partition and today, I hope would reduce these kinds of othering and kind of fear-mongering. That would be my hope.
We're coming to the end of this interview. Let me put this to you, and I ask this question deliberately. As you view things from your perspective in Chennai, bearing in mind the trends that we've already discussed, the imposition of Hindi, the BJP's ambition to have one party that rules both at the state and the center level, and the looming fear that the redrawing of constituencies at the Lok Sabha could be very adverse for certain states like yours and Kerala. Bearing all of that in mind, look down the road 25 years and tell me, what are your fears, what are your anxieties as India faces the next 25 years?
Look, I'm an eternal optimist. I've seen enough of the world. I've had the luxury of traveling widely, living and working in many places, in many industries, many careers. And I'm an optimist. At the end of the day, it is human nature that I am a believer in. I believe that all of us are inherently good people. All of us inherently want to live in a good society, want to raise our children well, want to be friendly with our neighbors, and want, the kind of camaraderie that comes out of human relationships. That's at the core of my being. I came to public service giving up a lucrative career based on that belief. That belief persists. Of course, there are many threats, but all over the history of the world, whether you look at it politically, militarily, you look at it in the markets, these aberrations don't last a long time, right? Somebody becomes too successful too fast. They start believing that they're near God, or the hubris sets in. And then what happens? There's a spectacular fall. The markets get completely overvalued to any rational logic. And what happens? There's a massive crash. People like Hitler get elected to power and start thinking that they can rule all of Europe, and they start going on warmongering, and then it ends spectacularly badly. So what I'm saying is, inherently, I believe it is in the nature of people that we will strike balances and we will find a way to coexist happily going forward. I believe that because I believe in human nature. I believe that a citizen of UP and a citizen of Tamil Nadu and a citizen of Gujarat and Bengal all share the same human values.
Can I interrupt?
Maybe I'm right. Maybe I'm wrong. Let me please give me the chance. Maybe I'm right, maybe I'm wrong. But what is within my power to do is to foster this sentiment or this approach to life as far as I can. Work on policies and government actions and plans which has been entrusted to be by my chief minister and to which I was elected by the people as best I can. And if all of this turns out to be too optimistic, it's okay. I'm willing to take that risk because at the end of the day, I'm a believer in God. And therefore, that gives me the faith that there are powers greater than any man, than any outcome, and whatever is supposed to be will be.
But very quickly, because time is against us, are you saying in that answer that India will muddle through, or are you saying India will overcome the challenges it faces? Which of the two?
I'm saying that India will overcome the challenges. I think everything is cyclical. Nothing is secular. Secular in the sense nothing is one directional, secular trend. Everything is cyclical. It'll go too far one side, the pendulum will swing back. It'll swing back too far the other side, it'll swing back. There was a time when Mrs. Gandhi controlled 2/3 of the majority in both houses and all of the states except one or two and imposed emergency. And the question was that who else but the Congress? Because since independence, nobody else had run this country, nobody else had administered this country, had run the government except the Congress. And at some point, the people said, it doesn't matter who else, just not you. And Mrs. Gandhi lost the election. You must remember that. So I'm saying at the end of the day, nothing is forever. Everything has a kind of natural cycle. And I have faith that India will survive and thrive eventually past all of this. That's why I'm an optimist. That's why I'm in public life.
Mr. Thiaga Rajan, thank you very much for making time for me. And thank you very much for giving us what we badly needed, a Southern perspective on how you view the 75 years since independence. I'm going to repeat the words you use. India today is a miracle. There is no other example in history, but it also has profound problems. That miracle is under threat. Thank you very much for talking to me. Take care. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me. Thank you for your time. Goodbye.